In Fairfield County, something new comes across my desk every day. Crimes are committed, cases are solved, and a community is made safe by the hardworking employees of the Fairfield County Sheriff's Office.
Welcome to This Week with Sheriff Dave Phelan, a weekly program on LancasterOhio.tv. We're also carried by a number of radio affiliates here in Lancaster. Do appreciate you, the viewers and listeners that join us each and every week. The program is actually taped at Fairfield Christian Academy. We appreciate the students. Behind the scenes, Kelly Roberts, our executive producer, does a good job lining guests up, getting the questions together, and a lot of good work behind the scenes. We have with us Director Scott Duff. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, Sheriff.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me to your show.
Yeah, well, it's good. And you are the director of Project FORT.
That is correct.
And FORT's an acronym for?
The Fairfield County Overdose Response Team.
Wow. So before we get into a little history about yourself,
sure.
What does that mean?
Well, our goal at the Fairfield County Overdose Response Team is to eliminate accidental overdoses that are occurring, and to also provide resources to overdose victims and their families, people with substance abuse disorders. We want them to know that there's resources available to them in the county to help them overcome their addiction, whether that be treatment, recovery, detox, things of that nature. We want to make sure that those resources are getting to where they need to get to.
Now, tell us a little bit about you've got really quite a long history in law enforcement. And you and I met over 20 years ago when I was a lieutenant with Columbus Narcotics.
We did, yeah. I spent 32 years with the Ohio Attorney General's office. The last 25 of those, I was at BCI. I was with the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Started as a street agent in narcotics and was promoted in 2004 to run what we call the newly created clandestine drug lab unit. So I did meth labs, and I was also in charge of the marijuana eradication effort. Eventually, under Attorney General DeWine's administration, I was in charge of what we called the heroin unit. I was the law enforcement liaison for the Attorney General's heroin initiative. So I was assigned I traveled all over the state, assisting in cases, assisting in getting programs established around the state with our outreach effort. So yeah, pretty long history. Most of it geared towards narcotics.
So in over 30 years, what's some of the major changes you saw as far as the way drugs trafficking operates in the state of Ohio during that time?
Well, it's amazing to me how many different kinds of drugs come through the state now, and the volume of the drugs that come through the state. I was assigned to a DEA task force in the late 90s, and that was when I first met you. You were the lieutenant in the narcotics unit. I was attached to one of those units at Columbus Narcotics within DEA, and we were working cases where we get 1 kilo of coke, 2 kilo of coke. We thought we were on top of the world. We knew who all the big drug dealers were. We knew where they lived. It was just a matter of getting them. It's a totally different ballgame today. There's so much dope moving through Central Ohio, Southwestern Ohio, that the routes are here. They're clearly established, and it's just a different ballgame today. We are now what's considered, like Dayton, for instance, even Columbus, is considered a source city. A source city is where the cartels hone in on. That's where the dope comes into, and then it's distributed out. We weren't a source city 20 years ago, but we are now.
And in Columbus, I know when I was a lieutenant with the Narcotics Bureau, we saw a lot of cocaine, a lot of crack, heroin. Has some of those dynamics changed too? Are they still seeing like a lot of the crack houses and things like that?
No, it's cyclical. I mean, we and I too worked a lot of crack cases, back in those days, and a lot of cocaine, mainly cocaine cases back in those days. I didn't work too many heroin cases, and then we started to see the influx of methamphetamine. We started to see the mom and pop labs, the small homemade laboratories pop up around the state. So that's when I decided to go back to BCI. I left the task force. I went back to BCI, and I had a tremendous amount of support from my administration and from my bosses, and we created the lab unit. We created the first, really the first standing response unit in the state to respond to meth labs. And we were just overrun with meth labs, it seemed like overnight, particularly in a county like this. I remember, mid-2000s, Fairfield County was just overrun with meth labs. So we did a tremendous amount with response and with training, with safety training, not only for law enforcement, but we did a lot of training for people outside of the law enforcement community who were entering people's homes, social service workers, utility workers, people that had an opportunity to go into someone's home. They needed that training because they were stumbling across active, sometimes inactive meth labs, and that was a really, really dangerous situation.
I remember just a few years ago where, as you mentioned, they were making a lot of meth in the county. They were doing the shake and bake. People would find the pop containers in their front yards,
Right.
and it really kept our response team very busy all the time, just trying to deal with those kind of things.
Right.
And I would say last year, I don't know that we had maybe a couple.
Just a few.
Yeah.
Just a few. I'm attached to the Major Crimes Unit in Fairfield County now, so I get to work closely with that enforcement group. My role's a little different than theirs.
Yes.
But still, I'm right there, and I pay attention to what those guys are getting involved in. And yeah, not too many meth labs anymore. Not too many.
So Operation Project Ford.
Yes.
So tell us, kind of go through the process of what you guys do.
Our goal is to, when an overdose occurs, whether that be in Violet Township, whether it be in the city of Lancaster, whether it be in the county, our goal is to, within 24 to 48 hours, we're not quite there yet, but our goal is to reach out to that individual who had that event, whether that be an accidental overdose, whether that be the family of someone who suffered, in that overdose. We want to put resources in their hands. We want to make sure that they understand what's available to them in the county, whether that be, through treatment, detox, recovery, a whole host of issues that come up. And I'm sure that the one thing that we have found is I had a hand in establishing some of what we call the quick response teams around the state when I was with the Attorney General's office. And most often, people really don't even realize the services that are available to them in their own backyards. And that's our goal. We want to put information in their hands. Now, it was important for the framework, for Commander Dennis Lowe at the task force and for others, it was important for them to maintain, or for Project Ford, for the director and for us to be involved, it was important for that to have a law enforcement component, because we're not naive enough to think that it wouldn't be necessary at times. One of the things that we have seen around the state are these spikes in overdoses, where we'll get 10 or 12 overdoses in a very short amount of time. We have to get on that right away. We have to try to identify that source of supply, cut that off as quickly as we can so other people aren't affected with those overdoses. So that's why it was really important for this to have a law enforcement component. Now, my role is certainly different. It's not like it used to be. And I'm sure that your officers, your deputies deal with it daily, and I know they do because I've talked to them. It's a different role for law enforcement today than it was just 5 years ago. The responsibilities have grown. We're asked to do more and more and more, and some of it at times is not necessarily deemed law enforcement related. But Sheriff, that's just where we're at. We have to take an active role. We have to change our mindset a little bit. And we have to make sure that these folks are getting what they need. Otherwise, they're going to end up in your jail. They're going to end up in prison. And your jail is your deputies, your correctional officers. They're not detox specialists. They're not treatment specialists. You know what I mean? So we have to make sure that what we're trying to do is more of a pre-arrest intervention, if we can, if it makes sense. It may not.
Well, and if you know around how many overdose deaths, or not, well, there's deaths, and how many overdoses do we have in Fairfield County during the course of a year?
Yeah, Fairfield County started collecting data a little differently. Data is always a tricky thing because most often the data that we deal with is very dated. So one of our goals is to make sure that we get real-time data, and we're working on that. I just heard from your communications director this morning, Joe, and he sent me some information. He's tracking the calls a little different now than he used to in the communication center. So since October of 17 to date, which is May 30th, there have been 46 accidental overdoses in the county. That's just the county. That's not the city. So according to the city numbers, which I can't recall off the top of my head, working with the fire and EMS guys, they're responding to 2 or 3 a week. So that's, multiply that times a couple. I mean, that's a lot of overdoses.
That is a lot.
And that's just in the city of Lancaster and in the county. That's not Violet. There's some other outlying areas that need to be counted in there. The city of Pickerington has several, not nearly that number, but they do have several. So, and that's another thing we're working on. I'm working on that with Lieutenant Churchill, and I'm working on that with Chief Lape, is trying to get a program that Ohio High has started called OD Maps, and that's really going to help us get real-time data. We can geocode that, and we know where these are occurring. Sometimes that's important for a bunch of different reasons. It's important because we want to do the outreach, and secondly, it's important to the enforcement guys because we can look at those maps and say, this is kind of a hot spot over here, maybe on the west end, that we need to concentrate our efforts on a little bit. So there's a multitude of reasons why we do, collect that data.
So of these multiple drug overdoses that we see every week, then if I understand correctly, at some point after that, I'm going to assume it's going to be a quick turnover, that you will actually try to make contact with the person who had the overdose.
That's our goal. And what we would do is, I would go out along with maybe someone from the recovery center, or what we call a peer support advocate. And what a peer supporter is someone that is in recovery, someone that has been there, someone that has walked that walk, and that is doing good, where recovery is working. So they can really relate, the victim of that overdose or the family of that overdose victim. They can relate to what this person is telling them, because they can look at that person and say, you know what, it does work, because here's an example of that.
We are just about out of time. Scott Duff, the director of Project Fort, we'd like to have you back next week and maybe talk about what are some of the resources that are available to people that may be listening or watching the program today. What are some of the resources for them, or if there's a family member that maybe could get in touch with you.
Sure.
And I know you'd be glad to help them. And
Absolutely.
Maybe some things. I know this program has been in other jurisdictions, to kind of see how those jurisdictions navigated through this. I know it's new to our county, but I think it's a wonderful thing. And I've often said there's 3 things that we need to do as far as the opioid, the methamphetamine addictions we see is number 1, education. Number 2 is enforcement, to do our dead level best to put people in the penitentiary that are bringing drugs into our community. But thirdly, and this is where I think Project Fort's going to be a big asset, is help, to get people help, because a lot of times, like you said, they do not know where to go.
That's right.
The clock on the wall says we're out of time. Till next week, same time, same place. God bless. If you're driving, buckle up.